Watercolor can be pretty intimidating, but with some simple techniques, you can learn to make art that makes you look like a pro. As you see in front of you, there's a couple different paintbrushes that you can use. These are what your watercolors are normally going to look like. They're in smaller tubes like this, usually because it's less is more with watercolor. Your brushes are going to be, you have our middle round brush. This is really good for doing wet on wet. Also for covering large areas, it's really good at holding lots of water. Our big flat brush is also good at covering large areas, and this one holds the most amount of water. Our smaller brush is, as you can probably guess, good for details. This is also good for doing wet on wet, but it is also, it holds a lot less if you're doing more like a dry brush. Like with any paints that you guys use, you're going to need a palette, some water, and also with watercolor, you're going to want to use a certain kind of paper. I, for this demonstration, am using the Strathmore watercolor paper, but another popular brand is the Arches paper. They tend to be super thick. That way the water, when it saturates it, it doesn't go flimsy and it's not going to bend on you. It holds water really well. The first step that I'm going to show you is a wash technique. This is good for when you're doing backgrounds. First, you want to flip your paper away from you on an angle. You want to make sure your brush is highly saturated. You're going to start at the right side, holding your brush flat, and you're going to drag your brush along. Now, it's okay that these little beads under here are building up. There's a way to get those off. And you just kind of take your brush around, cover the whole area. Alright, and that's how you do a wash. Comes out clean, crisp, and no brush strokes. The next technique I'm going to show you is a wet on wet. This is really simple to do, and you can get great effects with it. First, you take your saturated brush. I'm going to start with my round brush. Put some color down. Get fancy if you want. But as you see, you're using both colors, and they're both saturated with wetness, so they kind of blend in together. And you can add colors on top of each other, and as they dry, they're going to bleed more into each other, and it's going to create a better sense of depth. For the alcohol technique, what you're going to do is you're going to use just regular household alcohol, just regular rubbing alcohol. I like to use Q-tips. But you can also use your small round brush as long as you clean it out afterwards. You just simply dip this in the alcohol and touch the areas. So the alcohol actually works as a repellent for the watercolor. And depending on what object you use to put the alcohol down, it's going to leave that mark. Let's see, if I'm using my small paintbrush, you can make bigger drops. You can make it kind of like a rain. And as you see, it expands. Alright, the last technique that I'm going to show you is using salt. This one is probably one of my personal favorites because you can make the salt have your, you can make the salt do really cool things with your watercolors. This again is just a wet on wet template that I just did super quick. I have my sea salt grinder. You can use pretty much any type of salt. You can use Epsom salt, regular table salt, coarse salt, sea salt. And the bigger the salt, the more reaction you're pretty much going to have. So basically, I'm just going to grind this over my wet pigment, concentrate it in this one corner. Brush all the excess off. And if you can see, the salt works to kind of clump up areas.